small town in Ukraine with a doomsday clock ticking down.
Modern city doomed by human error.
Millions of innocent people affected by an improbable event.
What once was a home for many is now an abandoned city.
You all probably remember seeing the events of the explosion at the Fukushima nuclear power plant in Japan on March 12, 2011. On every news channel, we witnessed with our own eyes the destruction as innocent people lost their homes, families, and friends due to a horrific earthquake. This tragic event is very similar to the Chernobyl incident that took place on April 26, 1986, in the city of Pripyat, Ukraine. A malfunction in the control system led to an explosion that was so powerful that the zone of radiation traveled 30 kilometers from the plant. This catastrophe has had lasting impact on the world. And according to this graph from Statista, you can see the large impact that Chernobyl had compared to Fukushima and other nuclear events throughout the world. It is said to be one of the worst nuclear incidents in history, rating a number 7 on the International Nuclear Events Scale. It continues to impact people to this day through the many complications that have developed.
Today, we will be informing you of the many consequences that came from the Chernobyl disaster. First, we will talk about the history along with some background on the Chernobyl incident. Then, we will discuss the current conditions of Chernobyl. Lastly, we will talk about some of the environmental changes and relief efforts that were made within the area. First, let's start with the history along with the background on the Chernobyl incident. According to an article titled, Chernobyl Before and After, the Worst Nuclear Disaster in History, from InfoPlease and accessed on May 1st, 2016, Chernobyl is a Ukrainian word for mugwort, a common name for a herbaceous plant. Chernobyl was supposedly named after a combination of words korny and bilia, which literally means black grass. In 1569, the province housing Chernobyl became part of the Kingdom of Poland in 1793. Chernobyl was incorporated into the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic in 1921, and the nuclear power plant was commissioned by the government in 1977. The nuclear power plant was a boiling water reactor, and its main function was to slow down neutrons to make them more efficient in producing fission in the fuel. One of the most important characteristics about the reactor was that it possessed a positive void coefficient, where the increase in steam bubbles increased the core activity. According to worldnuclear.org, updated on April 28, 2016, as steam production in the fuel increased, the neutrons that would have been absorbed then produced increased fission in the fuel. The whole idea of creating this nuclear plant and reactor was to produce an immense amount of cheap electricity. According to an article titled Chernobyl Disaster, published on December 8, 2014, prior to the incident, there was an article written about the Chernobyl plant, published on February 1986, stating that the odds of a meltdown are 1 in 10,000 years. Just 2 months later, one of the world's largest nuclear accidents occurred in that very same plant.
The days prior to the incident at Chernobyl were as hectic as they could be. This is mainly due to an upcoming electrical engineering experiment scheduled for April 25th and 26th, 1986. In an excerpt from Richard Rhodes' book, Nuclear Renewal, found on PBS.org, states that the Chernobyl reactor was of a Russian design called the RBMK, which stands for Russian Большой мощности канал, meaning high-power channel. Furthermore, he stated that the reactor was fundamentally faulty and having built-in instability. The main instability with the reactor was that if coolant was lost, it would become more reactive instead of shutting down. Another structural flaw of the reactor was its lack of a containment structure. A containment structure is the shell around the reactor that stops radiation from leaking out in case of a meltdown. 20 kilometers north of the reactor lies the town of Pripyat, a small town of 49,000 people, most of whom are employed by the Chernobyl power plant. In an article from allday.com, written by K.C. Morgan, titled Pripyat Amusement Park, where the ghosts of Chernobyl play, describes the small amusement park that is now an icon of the Chernobyl incident. The amusement park was scheduled to open on May 1st, 1986 for the May Day Festival, but an unforeseen event caused an opening on April 26th. This event was the meltdown of Chernobyl's fourth reactor.
On the 26th of April, many people were left without their homes or even a place to live. The government of Ukraine and former Soviet Union sent many crew members into Chernobyl to pour sand over the fires and even used boron to reduce the contamination of radiation from expanding. The Soviet Union evacuated 115,000 residents and eventually evacuated 220,000 in subsequent years, according to nrc.gov, last access May 4th, 2016. Many people were affected by this catastrophe, and many health services were seen at the site. The main health service that was seen at the site of Chernobyl was the World Health Organization. Agencies such as the World Health Organization were concerned about the contamination that the residents had been in contact with when they evacuated. The majority of the 5 million residents that were living in Chernobyl at the time that were evacuated, they were susceptible to very low doses of radiation compared to natural background, which was 0.1 REM per year. According to the previously cited source, last access May 4th, 2016. According to LiveScience.com, last access May 9th, 2016, shortly after the Chernobyl accident, the leakage from the reactors entered into the forests and changed the landscape of the forest, which changed the color of the trees into a bright ginger color, which many termed the forest the Red Forest. There were drastic changes in the environment, and many people were trying to help.
The disaster at Chernobyl has impacted the animals, people, and the environment in a tremendous way. Now we are going to show you a video that will give you some insight into some of the current conditions at Chernobyl.
It was surreal, recognizing the severity of the accident and the magnitude of the release was just extraordinary. On my first visit to Chernobyl, there was almost no technical information being provided by the Russians. You know, this is, wow, I'm going into this area where there is a lot of contamination. There probably are something like a couple of hundred children that died from exposure to iron. And the tragedy is that they didn't have to. Chernobyl really concerns me on the one hand because because there are areas around there that still are heavily contaminated and which there's no intent to go in and decontaminate. They're just going to let it decay away. And one of the problems is people now are moving back into Pripyat even though they're not really, they shouldn't do it yet.
Chernobyl has been affected in many ways, and one of those ways has been by the animals in the surrounding area. According to an article from GreenFacts titled, "How Did Radiation Affect Plants and Animals?" and published on April 29, 2016, the radioactive materials released from the incident had many harmful effects on the plants and animals living 20 to 30 kilometers within the Chernobyl power plant. Depending on the dose of radiation the animals received, many of them responded differently. As you can see in these photos, many of the animals have mutations, an excessive amount of heads or legs, and sometimes even worn away fur and skin. It is said that animal species who were extinct prior to the incident eventually came back to life due to the radioactive materials in the surrounding area. Overall, when high doses of radiation were sustained within close distances of the reactor, there was an increase in mortality and a decrease in reproduction. During the first few years after the incident, plants and animals living in the exclusion zone, which is the 20 to 30 kilometers of the reactor, showed an incredible amount of genetic effects from the radiation. Even today, there are still reports of genetic effects in and beyond the exclusion zone. According to an article from National Geographic titled, "Animals Rule Chernobyl 30 Years After Nuclear Disaster," written by John Wendell and published on April 18, 2016, not only have animals been extremely affected by the radioactive chemicals, but they are said to be taking over Chernobyl. It may seem strange that Chernobyl, an area where one of the deadliest nuclear incidents occurred, could become a refuge for all kinds of animals. Without people hunting them or ruining their habitat, the thinking goes, and wildlife is thriving despite the high radiation levels.
On the day of the event, the people of Pripyat were not informed of the explosion, and many continued on with their daily routines, spending time with their families, working on their gardens, and dancing at weddings. The people of Pripyat never foresaw themselves having to leave their entire world behind within a few short hours. According to an article titled "Chernobyl, Before and After the Worst Nuclear Disaster in History," written by Jenny Wood, Last Access, May 4, 2016, 49,400 people lived in the city of Pripyat. And after 24 hours after the explosion, more than half of those people were exposed to radiation poisoning. Ever since then, the area has been uninhabited and will be unsafe for human habitation for 20,000 more years. It is still believed to be a continuous toll of the amount of people affected by the incident, but a report in an article titled "Nuclear Explosion at Chernobyl, Last Access" on May 4, 2016, reported 70,000 people suffering severe radiation poisoning from the event. Many plant workers and volunteers who took their time to help contain the fires and radiation leaks saw their first signs of symptoms with the many horrific symptoms they experienced. Many experienced severe headaches and metallic taste in their mouths that they said they experienced 2 hours after the explosion. According to the Mayo Clinic website, Last Access, May 4, 2016, if you are exposed to an excessive amount of radiation for an extended period of time, you can experience symptoms such as nausea and vomiting, headaches, fever, dizziness, and disorientation. Many people still live with these symptoms and abnormalities to this day, and many mothers still experience birth defects in their children that make living life for them very challenging. The Chernobyl incident caused many problems for people's health and will continue to be seen through many generations to come.
With the catastrophe of Chernobyl, the environment was severely changed. The urban areas were affected mainly on lawns, parks, streets, roads, the town square, building roofs, and walls. They were affected by the rain, which had contained radioactive particles in it. The agriculture of the area was also affected by the radiation. Radiation affected the dairy surrounding the area, which had contained high doses of thyroid in the milk, which was also present in the children. There were many efforts to reduce the contamination, but the government of Ukraine and the former Soviet Union denied to do anything to reclaim the buildings and landscape of Chernobyl.
The disbursement of radioactive particles and waste across the world called for relief efforts of every kind. Robert Gillette, a writer for the LA Times, published an article on May 11, 1986, titled "Chernobyl Disaster Sparked Private Relief Effort. U.S. Emergency Aid Arrives in Poland." In the article, Gillette talks about a small supply drop brought to Poland by the Americas Foundation. The supply drop consisted of 50 tons of dried milk, 30 tons of sterilized, long-life liquid milk, 1.3 million vitamin tablets, and 600,000 doses of potassium iodine to prevent absorption of radioactive iodine. The Americares Foundation wasn't the only group to give support. WHO, the World Health Organization, as well as many other countries and governments, supplied hospital equipment, food, and financial aid.
As you can see, the Chernobyl disaster of 1986 has impacted the entire world. In First Today, we informed you on some of the history behind Chernobyl, and some of the actions taken on the days prior and on the day of the event. Then we informed you on some of the current conditions now at Chernobyl, and how the disaster affected the animals, the people, and the environment. Finally, we informed you on some of the relief efforts that have been taking place to help with this disaster.
Every day, events happen that change the lives of someone, somewhere.
The Chernobyl incident still affects many people to this day.
The radiation is still within the city and may still be present for hundreds of years.
The town of Pripyat and the surrounding area will never be the same.
The physical landscape of the area will heal with time, but the scars